Voices from Oxford today is speaking to Jennifer Guest. Jennifer Guest is an associate professor in the University of Oxford and a fellow of the Queen's College. And to understand what she studies, I want you to imagine that you go to a very, very different part of the world from Western Europe, and that you go back in time around 1,000 years or so, and then you will arrive at the period that Jennifer studies, which, Jennifer, is medieval Japan, isn't it? And in the period when, or soon after, Japan was being greatly influenced by the contacts with China. Can you tell us more about that?
Yes. So, I mean, from the sort of the earliest examples of written texts in Japan, going back to the 6th, 7th centuries, where they really start to take off, texts imported from the continent were really important, often by way of the Korean peninsula as well. So you have a sort of a pan-East Asia connection. Texts ranging from Buddhist sutras to Confucian texts to works of poetry, medical texts.
All of this arriving in Chinese characters.
Yes.
Yes. And although many people watching this program may not think that this is so, Japanese and Chinese are actually rather different languages, aren't they?
About as different as you can get.
Exactly. Most people won't imagine that, but it is true. Now, what did they do, therefore? How did they cope with that?
So that meant that from the beginnings of writing in Japan, really, you have a range of strategies for dealing with Chinese characters, sort of different strategies of reading. So reading texts character by character in terms of their sound values in some way that might be related to the Chinese language, right. Or instead using the meanings of the words that those characters might be used to represent in Chinese through a kind of process akin to translation, but systematized into a kind of reading in order to read and write Japanese. So sort of dealing with the fact that you have a very different language with entirely different grammar. Taking a sentence that might look like Chinese, people in early Japan could, literate people, take that and rearrange the word order and read it out as Japanese.
Right, in order to fit better the structure of the natural language that they all grew up with.
And so the complex writing system that we have in Japan today is...
Yes, of course, arises from that because they had to add the characters that just express pronunciation rather than the meaning. Now, it takes me to another very extraordinary thing about the culture that you study, which is that if you reach back and ask the question, who would be the equivalent of, should we say Chaucer in England or Dante in Italy, you find that they're women. Yes. That's true, isn't it?
It is, which is one of the things that first drew me to this period. I mean, I think it's fascinating to have so many works of poetry and prose from an early period by named women, or at least we have some names for them. So some of this has to do with, I think, the trajectory of literary history in Japan up to the present, and the way that people have looked back to find their own literary heroes and fixed on people like Murasaki Shikibu, the author of the Tale of Genji.
She was the person who wrote the Tale of Genji, which is possibly the piece of medieval literature that most people at least might have heard of, even if they haven't read it.
Yes, and which is still massively popular in Japan today.
It is still popular today.
It has continued to inspire all sorts of other forms of art, from its creation, where it became popular at court, up until now, when I think there was a new movie a few years ago that came out.
And she was one of the court ladies, is that right, in the emperor's entourage? Would that be a good way of expressing it?
Yes, or maybe more specifically in one of the empress's entourages.
And one of the empress's entourages,
high-born court ladies, like empresses, would be surrounded by these lady attendants who had, literary or artistic talents.
So, I mean, maybe this is an unfair question on you, but let me try it. How did Japan then become one of the most male-oriented societies in the world? I mean, it's strange, isn't it? Because its early condition was very favourable to women, or so it seems. Is that right?
Yes. I mean, I think it's maybe difficult to compare and find a scale for, what is the most male-oriented society. But it's true that in the course of Japanese history, there certainly have been ups and downs in access of women to writing and to certain arts.
Right.
I think some of it is to do with not just production but circulation of texts.
Yes.
So in the Heian court, we're dealing with a fairly sort of a small and intimate society where people all know each other. Texts are circulating in manuscript or being read out loud to groups and sort of appreciated that way, being sort of lent out and borrowed. There's no sort of mass publishing per se.
No, of course.
I think once you get into the early modern period in Japan, then you have more of a sort of mass publishing culture, as you might in early modern Europe. There are more strict restrictions on, although women are still composing poetry, for example, it's rare for them to be published in that form. So I think the kinds of gendered restrictions that you see applied to women writers and artists exist in the Heian period as well, but still I think certain works like the Tale of Genji managed to circulate far enough to become well-loved and to survive.
Yes. I've got one final question for you, Jennifer, and this comes from me as a medical professor. I'm fascinated by the fact that Japan kept, much better than in China, some of the original medieval medical texts, the I Shimpo, which was kept in the tradition of the doctors who treated the imperial family for over 1,000 years. And this is quite remarkable. In China, with revolution after revolution, a lot of the texts have gone. So is it correct to see Japan as in some sense being the, as it were, the safe haven of many texts that originally came from China?
Yes, I mean, sort of counterintuitively, that is the case for a lot of literary texts as well. They might not have survived, in fact, past the transition to printing in medieval China, because they just weren't so popular, a century or two after their composition for whatever reason, but because they were transmitted in manuscript form to Japan and sort of kept in temples or passed down among poets who found them inspirational, they've actually survived there to today.
So in a curious way, if we want to know some things about medieval China, we can sometimes find the right texts being kept in Japan. That sort of sums it up, does it? Yes.
It's another piece of the picture, certainly, yes.
Well, thank you very much, Jenny, for talking to Voices from Oxford about a very fascinating culture, and good luck with your work and
thank you.
Teaching students, researching.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for talking to us.
Thank you.